Tonight I want to talk to you about a local boy, John Giles. He was caught up in the struggle between the Abenaki Indians and the English settlers. The Abenaki Indians were trying to protect their land and their way of life, and the English settlers were trying to gain prosperity and land at the expense of the Native Americans. John Giles is part of that struggle, and I want to read, I don't usually read from my book, but I want to read 2 paragraphs because they're going to make you uncomfortable, and at the end it's a quiz. You have to identify with one or both. That's during the talk. Okay. All right. Imagine you're a young boy. You're helping your family on a farm. You're grabbed by an angry Malecite warrior. You watch your father die, your mother and brothers captured. You cry for mommy. You're tied to a tree. Your captor continues killing and burning. You are so scared you wet your pants. You are dragged hundreds of miles to be an enslaved captive. You watch other captives tortured and killed. Your mother disappears, and after years as a slave, you are sold to a Frenchman. And in John Giles's view, you couldn't get any worse than that because Frenchmen were Catholics and he was Protestant. And his mother warned him the one thing he couldn't do after he was captured was become a Catholic. So he was kind of concerned about that. Or you are an angry Malecite warrior. You have seen your family and friends die from strange diseases. English settlers are stealing your land. They capture your friends and relatives and sell them into slavery. They attack your villages and kill and rape your wives and daughters. Your European ally, the French, urge you to strike back. Hundreds of you sweep down on exposed English settlements on your lands. You capture an English boy, girl, or woman. You kill older boys and men. You carry them back to your village to be your slave, or you can make them your drudge. You can torture them for fun. You can kill them. You can sell them. You can turn them into a whore or a boy of 2 spirits. When he is old enough to be a problem, you sell him to a French trader or a Jesuit. Okay. This is the terror of Maine, and this is the story. John Giles was a young boy. His parents, Thomas and Margaret Chalker, were English people. They came to the Maine area in the early 1670s. Thomas was from kind of like gentleman's class in England. He first came to Merry Meeting Bay area. After 2 years there, his father died, and he took the family back to England to get his inheritance. When he came back after 2 years, King Philip's War was going on, and he thought it would be too dangerous to come back to Maine, so he went to Long Island for a couple of years. After 2 years on Long Island, he said, I don't speak Long Island, so I am going to Maine. So he went back to Maine, and he went to Merry Meeting Bay, but there was no one there because of the Indian issues. So he came further east to Pemaquid. So he arrived here in the late 1670s. He bought a 60 by 120 foot lot in what is now Jamestown. Well, it was Jamestown then. Now it's colonial Pemaquid. One of those cellar holes might well have been his. He also bought some land on Fish Point in New Harbor for fish drying. And then in 1688, he bought 200 acres on the west side of the Pemaquid River. So starting at the river, going west this way, He bought 200 acres, part of which is where the mill and the old Bristol Historical Society building now is. The Rotner family owns quite a bit of that, the Sprowells. And my wife and I bought some of it a few years ago. We didn't know it was John Giles' land, but anyway, we own part of it. So they were farming basically that 200 acres. They had a cornfield, they had a hay field, they had a little farmhouse there. And in the late 1680s, the people at Pemaquid should have known trouble was coming. They were the farthest north settlement of any consequence in what the Indians called the Dawn Land, because obviously the sun comes up first here. And but Pemaquid was the outpost. That was the farthest north. And the Native Americans had thought they had an agreement with the Massachusetts government that there would be no settlements north of the Saco River. Obviously, Pemaquid's a long way north of the Saco River. And they had a fort there, Fort Charles, which was a wooden stockade. It's no longer there. And it was manned by a Captain Weems and started out with 150 men, most of which deserted in 1689 because they were royalists and King James II had been overthrown in England, and they were afraid they would be arrested like the New England governor, Governor Andros, had been arrested by Massachusetts authorities, thrown in jail, and then shipped back to England. Anyway, they were afraid that that would happen to them, and so they pretty much abandoned ship, leaving Weems with 15 soldiers and himself to protect the fort. On the morning of August 2nd, the Giles family left their house in Jamestown and went to their farm on the other side of the Pemaquid River. They worked in the fields and they had lunch, and just as they were leaving the farmhouse, they were overwhelmed by 40 out of 400 Indians and Frenchmen who were attacking the Pemaquid region. Most of the information comes from a memoir that John Giles wrote in later life, but it's substantiated by other things. Anyway, John's father, Thomas, was shot several times, and then John Giles and his brother James and Thomas started to run. Thomas escaped across the Barbican, the upper part of the river, and James and John was grabbed by a Maliseet warrior and tied to a tree. They proceeded to kill and scalp his father. They caught his mother and 2 daughters. And the youngest son, Tad or Samuel, had stayed at the fort, and he went in the fort and eventually made his way back to Boston. Anyway, John Giles was captured, tied to a tree. The Maliseet war party dragged John and the others off to Jamestown. So they spent 2 days trying to capture the fort, burning houses, capturing other English settlers. And finally, the commander of the fort negotiated a treaty where everybody in the fort got to sail away on a sloop, and all those outside got to go with the Indians. John was taken from the Pemaquid area, where the fort is, across to New Harbor. There's a trail there that's still called the Indian Trail, and they were taken across a trail from the fort to New Harbor. That trail follows that course. Anyway, they got to New Harbor, where they burnt and killed another 12 families and captured them. Then they got in canoes at New Harbor and sailed away for Pemaquid, which is now Castine, Maine, where John was, a Jesuit tried to buy John, and he met his mother there in Castine. She was taken there too. And she told John that whatever you do, don't let the Jesuits get you. You'll become a Catholic and you'll go to hell. So when he was offered a chance to, I mean, now he's 9 or 10. It's hard to tell because there's no birth certificate for John, but he's around that age. Anyway, he was offered a choice between the Indians and the Jesuit. He took the Indians. And the Malecite who had caught him brought him up to the St. John River, which is even further north. It's now the border between Canada and the United States. Anyway, John spent almost 9 years there, and he writes in some detail in his memoir about his bad experiences and his good experiences. He was tortured several times. He describes how the captives were made to dance around in a circle. Indians would throw fire coals at them, or they'd run out and throw them to the ground or toss them around. And sometimes he said he was rescued by a member of his Indian family because if they paid the ransom of a bag of corn, you could get your captive out of the circle. And so he reports how he was rescued several times by one of the young daughters of his Indian master. Anyway, he spent 9 years up on the St. John River, and it's interesting, he followed the same course as the Malecites did, which was in the summer they were down at the mouth of the river, in the winter they went up the river to hunt for moose and deer. And he describes how he quickly outgrew his clothes. He ended up wearing an Indian flap and an old skin that they gave him. He was made to do a lot of drudge work, carry water, go get it from the spring, go get the food, go get the fish. Anyway, and all the time he's worried about that at one of their dances, he's going to be the victim, because often it had happened that they would bring in a new captive and for fun they would torture and kill their captive. So John lived in that fear, and he made some friends, other captives, a boy by the name of Evans who was from Casco Bay, and they had several adventures, according to John, while he was a captive. One time they even fooled their Malecite captives into thinking that the Mohawks were coming to attack them, because the one thing the Eastern Abenakis were afraid of was the Iroquois, particularly the Mohawks, because it was reported that the Mohawks actually ate their captives. So they went one step further. So anyway, John and his friend, one night it was dark, they had gone to get water, they had these big buckets, and Evans had the idea that we'll pretend that the Mohawks are coming and we're going to scare our Indians. So they went back, and Evans said, oh, he thought he saw other Indians, they were strangers, there were actually stumps out there. But when they brought the other Indians back, John and his friend kicked their buckets of water down the hill, and the Indians thought they were being attacked, and they all ran away. John thought was really funny. And it is really funny when you think about it. Anyway, John was there for 9 years, and when his first master sold him to another Indian, and then that male Indian, the master, died, and the Indian wife couldn't decide what to do, so they had a Indian consultation, and the Indians were the woman master, mistress, whatever you want to call her, was suggested that, well, she and the former master couldn't decide who should own John, the earlier master or her, and so they couldn't decide, and so the Indian powwow, as John would say, decided that her only option was to either kill John because they didn't want a conflict within the family group, or they could sell him to a Jesuit, which John didn't like. Anyway, the local Jesuit, and virtually all these tribes had a priest who lived with them. There was one on the Kennebec, there was one at Penobscot, there was one up on with the Maliseets. Anyway, they favored and fought with the Indians against the English because the English were Protestants and they were Catholic. Anyway, John was taken down 40 miles down the river to the mouth of the river where there was a French ship. And he was brought on the ship, and he describes how he was really embarrassed because he had no clothes and everybody else was all dressed up. And the Jesuit offered to buy him and take him back on the boat. And he didn't want to do that, and they offered him another alternative, which was, well, we can sell you to a French couple, and you can go with them. So he decided after a night that he would go with the French couple. So they took him back to the boat. He met the French couple. They purchased him from the Indians, and he went home with the French couple. He liked the French woman. She knitted him a nice shirt. She gave him good clothes, a coat. He was all dressed up, and he got to help run their trading post. They had a trading post. And he worked there for 2 years, and then the Americans came up the St. John River to attack the French fort there and the Indian town Medunctit, which was where John was. Anyway, John, meanwhile, the French man had gone back to France for something that doesn't really make any difference. And she was left there with John to run the store. The Americans were coming. She had little kids. She asked John if he would help her hide all their goods. And in exchange, when her husband came home, her husband would put him on a boat for Boston. So John, who by then is 17 or 18, takes his mistress's trading goods out to what was called Long Pond. It's still there near the St. Johns River. It's still called Long Pond. And he took the goods across the pond, hid the wife and kids and the goods in the woods, and then went back to their house and trading post and explained to the Americans that these French couple had really been nice to him. They shouldn't burn her house and steal her stuff. And anyway, they fell for it, and they didn't burn the trading post or the house. The Americans left, taking some other Indians captive. He stayed, even though he could have left, but he stayed for whatever reason, and brought the goods back to the store. The next year, the husband comes back from France. The wife tells him what he's done, what a nice guy he was, how he saved their trading post. And so Another year goes by, and another American boat comes to the North River, and the Frenchman puts him on the boat, and the boat captain wants to charge John for getting him back to Boston. John doesn't have any money, so he's kind of worried. But finally, somebody else on the boat says, well, I'll pay for his fare to go. Just kind of interesting that. Anyway, he goes back to Boston. He arrives in Boston in June of 1699, which is almost 10 years since he was captured. Meanwhile, things he didn't know had happened, or while he was gone as a captive, was that they rebuilt the fort at Pemaquid. They built Fort William Henry, which lasted all of 2 years when the French and Indians attacked it in 1696 and destroyed that fort too. There was also King William's War had started, one of a series of 5 major wars in Maine. There was the first Abenaki War, there was King William's War, there was Queen Anne's War, there was Dummer's War, and there was the French and Indian War. And to those people involved, in whatever name you called it, it didn't make any difference, because the settlers and the Abenaki tribes were still killing each other. And the other thing that started with the sacking of Pemaquid, and they captured at least 50 captives, which they, and a number of scalps, which they were paid 20 crowns for a scalp in Castine, and the captives were sold for 40 crowns. Anyway, John's mother, he didn't know this until later, had been sent to Canada, where she was ransomed along with his 2 sisters, Margaret and Mary. They went back to Boston. The mother died before John got there. His 2 sisters married people in Boston and had families. His brother James, who was captured with him and had stayed in Castine when they were brought there in 1689, tried to escape with another Englishman. They got back as far as New Harbor, where they were recaptured, brought back to Castine, and were tortured and killed. There was a plaque in Castine up until a couple years ago that described how James was had his ears cut off, his nose cut off, he was burnt at the stake, and some friends of mine and us went to look for the plaque, the Huffmans, and the town fathers in Castine had removed the plaque, which no longer exists on the rock on the hill in Castine. And we asked at the Historical Society, do you know where that bronze plaque is? It was one like is over at Samoset, you know. They had it on a rock. Anyway, only it was a little more unfriendly. And the Historical Society said, oh, it must be at the town hall. We went to the town hall. They said, oh, it must be at the Historical Society. Anyway, it's gone. But there are photographs of this plaque that was there. But it's kind of interesting aside. Poor James got killed in a very difficult way. John didn't know this until he got back to Boston. And actually his brother, the youngest brother, Samuel, or Tad, met him at the wharf, came down to meet him. And John then starts his, the triumphant part of the story. We've gone through the ordeal, now we're in the triumph part. John becomes an interpreter for the Massachusetts government because he could speak English. He had learned French from his French masters, and he spoke Abenaki Indian. Of course, every tribe spoke a different dialect of Abenaki, so communication always wasn't good. He was interpreter for from 1699, the end of it. He was hired as soon as he got there. For the next 16 years, he hired himself out as an interpreter. He went back many times to Maine as an interpreter to retrieve captives, to help negotiate treaties. But the treaties, after every war, the Abenakis and the Indians signed a treaty where they promised goodwill, friendship, and amity forever. And they didn't, I like to say, they heard, but they didn't listen to each other. They were both talking, saying something, but it wasn't. The English would say, we possessed so-and-so land because you sold it to us, and we're not giving it back. And the Indian leaders would say, no, we didn't sell it to you, it's still our land. And they'd go through this, and they would sign the treaty, and then they'd go back to whatever else they were doing. And in the process, every treaty, the Indians surrendered more land in the treaty. And they started out, they didn't want any English people in the Don land. But every treaty, they kind of moved eastward. So they started out with the first treaty, you can't go beyond the Saco River. Next treaty, you couldn't go beyond the Kennebec River. Next treaty, you couldn't go beyond Pemaquid. The last treaty, they couldn't go beyond the St. George's River. Didn't stop the English at any point. John was involved in a lot of these interpretations, and he was made a militia captain. And in 1715, the proprietors of the Pejebscot patent, which eventually became the Kennebec patent, decided it was time to develop their property around Brunswick. They thought the Indians were under more or less control, which turned out to be a mistake. Anyway, John Giles was sent with 15 men to build a fort. Fort George replaced another fort, Andros, which the Indians had burnt earlier. Anyway, they built Fort George on the Androscoggin River. You probably all know where the Cabot textile mill is. It's now a big antique thing. Anyway, it's right near the falls on the Androscoggin. The fort was there. It's now underneath the mill. I think everybody it was dismantled in 1758. I think all the local people took the stones home to use for foundations and the wood to build their houses. Anyway, it disappeared. And there's nothing left of Fort George. John Giles was the commander at Fort George for 10 years, during which time there were a lot of conflicts with the Indians. There were a number of fights with the Indians around Fort George. There was one big battle on the Kennebec River, which John Giles didn't participate in, but he was still at the fort. That was during Drummer's War, or Father Rale's War. Father Rale's was a French priest who had taken up residence in the Kennebec tribal town of Norwich Rock. And they had a large Indian village there. The English, Massachusetts government finally declared that Father Rale had committed treason, even though he wasn't English, by violating the Massachusetts law that prohibited Jesuits from coming onto any Massachusetts land. Anyway, so they sent a force of 206 Rangers under Captains Harmon and Johnson up the Kennebec River. The first time they went up in March and the ice gave way, they never got to Norwich Walk. So they went back to the forts, and in the spring, they went summer, they went back up the Kennebec River. They attacked the village at Norwich Walk when turns out most of the Indian warriors were off hunting, but that didn't, it's like early version of Custer. Anyway, the Rangers attacked the Indian village. They killed or captured 30 or 40 Indians, mostly women and children. They had been offered 100 pounds for the scalp of Father Rale, so they dutifully took his scalp and brought it back to get their 100 pounds. Anyway, that was the last major battle between the English and the Abenaki on the Kennebec River. The Kennebecs came back in some little part, but not like it was. During the battle at Norwich Walk, the militia captain Johnson described that the river ran red with blood. That's actually the title of my next book, but anyway. So it was very gory. Most of the Kennebec Indians after that moved to Canada to a village of St. Francois, and they would go and come back, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in war parties back to Maine, but Kennebec were pretty much gone after that. In 1725, the English, having extended their northern boundary beyond Pemaquid to what's now Thomaston on the St. George's River, sent Giles to command the fort at Fort St. George's on the St. George's River, and he stayed there for 17 years as the commander of that fort, during which he also spent a lot of time interpreting for conferences there with the Native Americans and the English. He handed out bounties sometimes for scalps, sometimes for wolves. They didn't like wolves either. So, but there was a continuing violence along the St. George's River. At one point, Samuel Waldo, who became a militia general and later captured Fortress Louisburg, had a land patent, the Musgunkus patent, which he was developing, part of which included Thomaston and the St. George's River. He went there in 1736, and Giles was his interpreter, and Waldo said he purchased the land from the Indian sachem Macadawando, who later said, no, he didn't actually sell the land, he just drank Waldo's liquor and it was good. Anyway, Waldo brought Giles back to Boston to testify before the general court that Waldo had actually bought the land from the Indians, and he owned it twice, once from a royal grant and now from the Indians. Anyway, Giles was brought before a committee, and he said, I'm just an interpreter. I don't know what they agreed to. So he wouldn't say that Macadawando had sold the land. He wouldn't say he didn't sell the land. Waldo swore he had, and he didn't care anyway, he said, because he had it. So, and that actually ties, is where I came into Giles to write this book, was when I was writing my previous Maine book, Fire and Ice, Henry and Lucy Knox and the Settling of Maine. It's when I came across Giles because of Waldo, who was Lucy Knox's grandfather, and Lucy Knox inherited a good part of the Waldo patent from her father, 700,000 acres, and then they bought another 2 or 3 million acres, but that's the other story. Anyway, Giles stayed there, and at one point, his old, one of his Indian masters came to the fort, and you would think Giles, I mean, if I were Giles, I would have had him locked up, but Giles said, oh, he treated him, and they had a good talk, and the Indian went back to the Penobscot and the St. Johns River. Giles was replaced in part because the Abenaki preferred another man by the name of Jabez Bradbury, who had succeeded Giles at Fort George on Merry Meeting Bay. And then as they moved north, they wanted Jabez Bradbury to be the commander and the trading post manager at Fort St. George's. So Giles was replaced by Jabez Bradbury, and Giles went back to Boston. He lived in the part which is now Roxbury, died there in 1755. He was married twice, once in 1703 and once in 1718 when he was at Brunswick. He married the commander, the daughter of the man who eventually sacked Norwich Walk. They, as far as I know, didn't have any children. I couldn't find that they had. There are no descendants of the Gileses in Pemaquid that I know of. There are Gileses in Booth Bay, but it's spelt with an I. And the people at the Booth Bay Historical Society assured me that it was a different family. So, not the same Giles. One of the things that, and I'm going to open up the questions in a minute, but I want to do one thing that I thought was interesting and important, and that is that early on, the Abenaki became, I wouldn't say addicted, but dependent on English and French trade goods. They traded in their guns. They traded in their bows and arrows and spears for guns early on. Who wouldn't? Because they were much better. Guns and ammunition. They liked English alcohol, and they liked all the other supplies that the English brought: food, clothes, especially steel knives and hatchets. Problem was that they had to pay for these, and they started paying for them in furs, and at the beginning there were lots of furs. But as the Indians stepped up their commercial development of hunting and killing fur-bearing animals, and the English moved in more and more on their land, there were fewer and fewer furs to trade for what they wanted at the trading post. And so in one of these like strange kabuki dances, you have the Englishmen and Frenchmen selling and gifting guns and ammunition to the Abenaki, who then in turn used them to hunt, but also to kill Englishmen. And during this whole 100-year period, during each treaty that they would sign, the Indians insisted that the English have a trading post at whatever the demarcation line was. And so that the Abenaki could trade for knives, hatchets, guns, ammunition, and all the other English goods. Unfortunately, they ran out of furs to trade, and so they developed this, I guess you'd call it a system, whereby the native Indians captured English men and women, brought them to Canada where they were ransomed and paid for, and they came back and bought stuff at the trading posts in Maine. So they did this captive. Part of the Indians wanted to get, by the 1720s, the Indians were divided between those who wanted to get along with the English and those who still were irreconcilables and wanted to get rid of them. And so you have this captive exchange for money going on, and then the coastal Indians, particularly the Penobscots, the Maliseets, and the Micmacs, discovered that the easiest way to get ransom money was to capture fishermen and their boats and ransom the boats and the fishermen. You didn't have to go to Canada. You just got the money from the fishermen. And so they developed this piracy scheme where they would capture English boats and fishermen and ransom them and then use that money to spend at English trading posts. And so that went on, the piracy went on until basically the 1740s and 50s, when the English government decided, well, at the request of the Massachusetts government, to send some naval vessels to patrol the coast of Maine, and that kind of cut down on the ransom of the fishermen and their boats. But it's this whole complex situation going on where, you know, when you just read the regular history books or even local histories, there's Englishmen versus Indians, and it seems simple, but then you start looking into it and it gets more and more complicated until you're trying to figure out, well, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in this? Which, before we get to the questions, brings me back to the point about the two paragraphs. So this is your cognitive test for the night. You can raise one hand if you are left hand if you identify with John Giles, right hand if you identify with his Maliseet warrior, or both hands if you feel bad for both of them. So here's your chance. Raise your hands. I'm like two hands because I give up. So anyway, there's a lot more in the book because it's 120-something pages, and I kind of skipped through it. But and it does also has John Giles's memoir reprinted in it, which is interesting to read. It also has a number of his letters in it, which he wrote as when he was a commander of forts, which are a challenge to understand because he wrote English phonetically, and it's very difficult to read. Anyway, but they're interesting. Anyway, that's my story. Any of you have any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. Toward the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that his father purchased land here.
Yes.
Who did his father purchase his land from?
Okay, he purchased it from the agent of Governor Andros, who was then the governor of what was called New England, which stretched actually from New York to Maine. So his land patent was from the agent of Governor Andros. It's not an Indian deed. None of the Giles property was purchased from Native Americans directly. But yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
Given the value of captives, as slaves or to be ransomed. Why was John Giles' younger brother killed?
Because he tried to escape. And as a lesson to all the other people, if they caught an escapee, they were killed in a very miserable way. And that was also early in this whole process. Talking in 1691 when the brother was killed, and the Abenaki still were trading furs for all these goods. They were getting money, but they were also getting money for scalps. It was beginning to evolve into this more commercial aspect of life. That's a good question. Yeah.
So, of course, the British were also kidnapping
Yes.
Indians and bringing them back to England.
Yes.
That was set being an example.
Yeah.
Were the captains, like Giles, sometimes held for ransom, basically, as a trade to get the...
They did trade captives. I mean, Giles went on several ventures as interpreter, where they went to Penobscot and they brought Indians from Boston up to Penobscot and traded them for. There weren't as many. There were a number of cases where Native Americans were not only brought to England, which would have been fairly nice, but a lot of them were sold as slaves in the West Indies or the Azores or some other miserable place. Well, it's nice now, but then it wasn't. There were a lot more. The Indians did not make good slaves. The men tried to escape all the time, had a tendency to kill their masters. The women and children simply ran away. That they tried making Indian women and children servants, they just left. So it was not quite as productive for and the English people came as almost often as villages. A whole group of people would come and settle. They were there for agriculture, developing commercial things. They weren't they had other things to trade. They weren't like, they were more into killing Indians than capturing them, to be honest about it. Yeah, somebody had a question over here. No? My peripheral vision's not any good. Hi.
I understand that people from England would come to the New World for a variety of reasons, but John Giles' father, they weren't from a poor family.
No.
I mean, shed any light on why someone from a fairly well-to-do or stable family would want to come at that time?
Usually it was younger sons, because in England, everything went to the oldest son. So younger sons had to go someplace. Often they became soldiers. Often they would emigrate somewhere. And Jody knows more about the early period than I do. I mean, I didn't go back to the early 1600s. And so, but they did capture, I mean, the first English captain here, Captain Weymouth, captured several, I don't know if they were Wawanocks, they were some kind of Abenakis, and took them back to England as curiosities more than anything else. And that continued for the first early voyages, but then once curiosity was satisfied, then they moved on to other things. So, but.
Just so you think because he had 4 sons, it was for opportunities for his family?
Well, yes. I mean, that was what most of them came. Land was not free. Well, it was for a lot of people. There were a lot of squatters in Maine. Let's be honest about it. They just came here, took the land, and said, "It's mine." But there was a lot of opportunity to purchase land for very little money. You know, even as late as when Henry Knox was selling land, he was getting like $2 an acre, which is pretty inexpensive even then. But, you know, and so they it was just a great opportunity. I don't think there was any way that Thomas Giles thought he could buy 200 acres in England, which is why he came here. You know, and there were a lot of people like that. And there were some very few who came here for religious reasons. That ended pretty quickly. But it was mostly economic opportunity, as far as I can tell. And not true. It's true not just in Massachusetts, but the whole American other colony. Yeah.
The Jesuit relations talk about Father Rale and Orange Rock a fair amount. Do they discuss anything about the St. John's community that
Yes, there is. Father Thury was actually the priest who led the attack on Pemaquid, captured John Giles. But there are some letters from Father Rale from Jesuit relations that they're in French, so some of my translations might be a little iffy, but I shouldn't say that because my French-Canadian mother would be very unhappy with that. But anyway, the Jesuit relations are mostly in French, but there are a lot of letters. And they befriended the Indians. They tried to convert them, and often did. But they are also often very critical of the Indians and the way they lived their life. They wouldn't give up being hunter-gatherers. They tortured prisoners. They did a lot of things that even the priests couldn't stomach. And they were able to take quite a bit because they spent a lot of time with the tribes in Maine, so without objecting too much. They did try to buy a lot of captives, including John Giles, but yeah.
I'm trying to picture when the Giles were attacked. Were there other farms or farmers in that area with them at that time, or even?
Okay, at that time, yeah, there were about 200 families around Pemaquid. The Giles farm was one of the furthest away from the fort, hence the 200 acres that he managed to get. It's kind of iffy as to the exact numbers of people, but one woman, Hageman, who was also captured from Pemaquid at that time, later testified to the Massachusetts government that when she was at Castine, there were more than 50 English captives from Pemaquid at Castine, which included the Giles family, but also a number of others, several from New Harbor, Peter Hope's not here, but he often talks about the cellar holes that they found in New Harbor early on. And according to Giles, the Indians burnt the 12 houses that were there. And they may well be those foundation holes that Peter Hope and his friends found in the woods when they were kids.
There were about 300 people living in Pemaquid during that attack.
About 300?
6 families living up in Pemaquid Falls when Thomas Giles was killed and John was captured.
Okay.
I have been studying.
Yeah. I actually got the 200 families from your book, so if you say 300, I can't argue with you. But that's where I got my 200.
The village where I worked
Yeah,
was the main focal point of the whole plantation.
right.
You had a fishing village, as you pointed out, in New Harbor. There's probably about 12, 15 families living there, so maybe 60 people. And then up at Pemaquid Falls, probably 10, 15,
Yeah.
20 people up there.
Would you count Damaris Cove Island too? There were people out there?
I couldn't say.
Oh.
That was more of a seasonal operation. Even
Yeah.
At that point. But,
There were a few
so anyway,
people,
it was-
in Newcastle.
Fish Point. John
Yeah.
owned land over there.
Yes, yeah. Yep. Yeah, I stole stuff from your book, so, but I cite your book, so I'm covered.
Any other questions for Gerry? I think that was great. Thank you.
Thank you.